I am pursuing a Master of Arts in Education degree because I plan to become a math teacher, which will allow me to contribute to the growth of my community. I have always had an immense love for math, more so than any other subject. During high school, I spent many hours tutoring friends and acquaintances that were experiencing difficulties in their math classes. I truly wanted them to see the beauty in math. While they did go on to do better in their classes, I don't think they fully embraced my romanticized view of math. The principles of interdisciplinary learning and teaching class has really helped guide me on my path to pursuing a career in education by giving me an overview of the educational system. It is interesting to see how the educational system has evolved throughout the years. The traditional education style, with the teacher standing at the front of the classroom, is becoming more outdated, and there is now a trend that is leaning more towards a progressive approach, which looks at the variances in how students learn. This knowledge will help me when I teach math because I'm sure that I will have a wide variety of students to work with, so it is critical for me to have the constant awareness that each student may require different ways of being taught a lesson. The idea of interdisciplinarity broadened my perspective with the notion of the convergence of multiple academic disciplines. I am an artist and would love to teach a math class that is converged with an art class, which will allow students to grasp math through a more visual perspective. Math can be a challenging subject, and many students are visual learners, so combining art and math would enhance the educational process. Learning about the socio-political nature of education has been very eye-opening and mind-broadening. The social justice module showed me that there are still students being educationally marginalized for various reasons, which is resulting in educational inadequacies for these students. According to Jean Agnon, there is a hidden curriculum that affects the education process in schools. She looked at social class and determined that it is actually based on one's relationships to society. In Agnon's review of the working class school system, she noted that students are required to follow steps laid out by the teacher, but that there is often no further explanation on why steps should be followed. Thus, the grades are generated based on the student's ability to follow steps rather than the answer being correct. For the middle-class school system, Agnon indicated that grades are based on the correct result rather than just being able to follow the steps. In the wealthy school systems, the students are given more liberty to make decisions on their own, which allows them to take on more ownership throughout their education. Agnon believes that these different educational approaches in each school system can cause students to have very different relationships with society. Paulo Freire discussed the dehumanization aspect of those that have been oppressed by social injustice in education. He believes that the relationship between the oppressors and the oppressed can only be healed by a mutual process of both parties returning to humanity. The oppressed need to be active participants in the creation of the pedagogy that will set them free. The first stage of the pedagogy is when the oppressed acknowledge that they are oppressed and then make the changes needed for liberation. The second stage occurs when the changes have been implemented and the pedagogy is for all people, not just the oppressed. It really disturbs me that there are still injustices within our current educational system, such as the achievement gap and the significant curriculum differences between schools that have little funding versus schools that have a lot of funding. Educators need to be aware of these injustices and strive to correct these issues because our students are being affected and we need to take care of all of them, not just some. In order to have social justice in education, there needs to be a strong foundation on relationship understanding and a liberating pedagogy that is embraced by both educators and students. This directly relates to teaching math because the relationship between the teacher and the student is critical to the learning process. When the relationship is based on mutual respect and understanding, the students will feel more comfortable asking questions and the teachers will be able to address the questions more freely. B.F. Skinner believed in the learning theory of behaviorism, which encompasses that behavior is determined by conditioning. Skinner created the theory of operant conditioning that entailed looking at the way consequences of the behavior reinforce the behavior. Jean Piaget was a strong advocate for the learning theory of cognitivism, which looks at the mental processes of students. He viewed the acquisition of knowledge as a spontaneous process that was contingent on the internal activity of the student. Knowledge is built on operations that enable the student to gain a better understanding of an object and to grasp the foundation of what is occurring, whether it is a mathematical equation or a specific process being taught in a biology class. Learning is brought about through situations which help construct logical structures internally in the student. The student uses internal active processes of equilibration and self-regulation to facilitate the learning process. Piaget believed that the relationship between development and learning was one of assimilation. Lev Vygotsky supported the learning theory of social constructivism. He did not see an association between the developmental and learning processes as Piaget did, and rather saw them as being independent of one another. Vygotsky saw learning as an external social process that required active students and active educators. Even though a student's acquisition of learning can affect their development, Vygotsky still did not view a relationship between the learning and developmental processes. The developmental process was thought to come after the learning process, so it was possible to have a lag between the two processes. This lag contributed to the zones of proximal development. An example of this is a 9-year-old student that has the mathematical ability of a 7-year-old student. Lev and Wagner supported the theory of situated learning, which encompasses an approach called legitimate peripheral participation. Legitimate peripheral participation views the learning process as a result of engagements in socialization. Learning through different social settings requires constant active participation. Thus, the active participant is constantly in a state of learning, evolving, and becoming. The participant will also engage with others within the community such that the knowledge that the participant has gained is somehow transmitted or communicated to other community members. Papert and Harrell were strong advocates for the learning theory of constructionism. The constructionism theory views the learning process as something that occurs when the students create constructions or models pertaining to the lesson being taught. Several examples were used to show different ways of how art and math can be combined and used to engage students to learn about math. Malcolm Knowles supported the adult learning theory, which looks at andragogy as a new theory to apply to adult learners. The andragogical theory is based on the following premises. The individual transitions from being dependent to becoming independent and self-reliant. The experiences of the individual are utilized during the learning process. Continued education is contingent on what the individual needs to learn for different jobs. The learning orientation for the individual is problem-centered. Skinner's behaviorism and reinforcement has a large role in teaching, from primary and secondary schools to higher education. When learning math, a student's confidence in being able to work and understand a problem is critical. It is important to reinforce a student with positive feedback when they are able to figure out a problem on their own or even with assistance. This additional reinforcement will help the student to face more challenging problems in the future. Piaget's theory of cognitivism can be readily seen in primary schools through the use of visual aids. The students are actively interacting and exploring what is being taught. An example of this would be using foam letters to teach the students about the alphabet. Since the alphabet is the building block for language, it is critical that the students learn the alphabet prior to learning how to write. Vygotsky's social constructivism theory is evident from primary schools to higher education. It is imperative for math educators and educators overall to know where their students are developmentally. Educators should be checking in with their students daily to see how they are doing with the current lesson and to ensure that the student thoroughly understands the information. Skinner's behaviorism theory is applicable to teaching students with disabilities because It promotes the educator to use positive feedback with the students in order to strengthen the behavior that is needed to be successful in an inclusive classroom. Piaget's theory of cognitivism operates on the idea of the student thoroughly grasping a lesson before moving on to the next lesson. This would benefit all learners because it will ensure that they have the basic knowledge prior to advancing to the next level. Vygotsky's social constructivism theory was applied to a study performed by Carol Lee that utilized 3 different types of classroom instruction based on the idea of cultural scaffolding. Scaffolding looks at ways to give temporary support to students in order to facilitate and reinforce the learning process. The study implemented the culture of students within 3 separate classrooms. Each classroom of African American students, Hawaiian students, and Hispanic students was located in different parts of the United States. The cultural implementation into each classroom resulted in significant learning achievements for the students. When I teach math in the near future, my plan of action will entail being very cognizant of my school's socio-political atmosphere so that I can determine what changes need to be made to make the educational process better for the students. I plan to utilize a more progressive approach such that the students and I will be in constant dialogue on their educational process and progress. My daily check-in with the students will enable me to see how they are progressing and if there are any learning or understanding issues that require additional guidance. I plan to apply Papert's and Harrell's constructionism theory when teaching math because I can see how it would be very beneficial to the students.